Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series, Seeing is Believing, Communicating Research Through Virtual Worlds. My name is Jiyoon Yi, and I'm a fellow of the Professors for the Future program hosted in the UC Davis Grad Studies. And this project is co-sponsored by the GradPathways Institute for Professional Development, Professors for the Future, and Public Scholarship and Engagement at UC Davis. Mary, do you want to introduce yourself?
I realized I muted myself to blow my nose. Hi, everyone. I am Mary Martin Mabry, the Director of Communications and Marketing for Public Scholarship and Engagement. And because I'm sure most of you have not heard of us, we are a university-wide office that's dedicated to building and supporting meaningful relationships between communities and UC Davis scholars. And just because I have the opportunity, I'm going to put a little bit more of a plug in there. We do that by championing public scholarship, bringing together groups of people to build relationships, partnerships, and networks, and then connecting communities to university resources through research, student learning, technical assistance, and workshops like these. And if you are like me and wondering what public scholarship means, if we think of conventional academic writing as for a specific group of specialists, public scholarship is things that we do in public, with the public, and with the potential to impact the public. So as we'll talk about today, it's extroverted and appeals to a general audience.
Yep, awesome. So here's a couple housekeeping things before we get started. So the first 20-minute presentation will cover general idea, and after that, we will have a short hands-on activity, which is optional, but we highly encourage you to stay and create your own work. The presentation part will be recorded and shared with the attendees to enable asynchronous review between each session of the webinar series. And please stay muted, but you're more than welcome to ask questions in the chat. And at the end of the session one, please complete a 1-minute survey on this webinar, which will greatly help us. So this is the first session of the webinar series, and we've designed 5 short sessions, each discussing one topic at a time to minimize Zoom fatigue and also provide options to review materials asynchronously between each session. So this week we'll focus on the public audiences and the effective message delivery. The next week will be more about learning technical skills to create virtual environments. And at the last session, we'll share how these learned skills could be integrated to a research project and discuss how it could be applied to your own research as well. And for today, we'll be focusing on what's different when talking to the public about your research and why it's important. Having said that, at the end of the session one, you'll be able to understand why we should change visuals when talking to the public, set your own goals and objectives, and identify your targeted audiences. With that, I'll share a little bit of my experience that motivated me to come up with this project. So this is an example of my PhD research in food science. And like many of you here, I spent a lot of time collecting data, writing manuscript, which was exciting for me. But then when I showed this to my friends and family, they were like, oh yeah, you look so smart, but I don't know what's going on here. So I was trying to rephrase my research by showing this cartoon. And I told them actually my research was about the 5-second rule. Then they were asking me, is it really safe to pick up food within 5 seconds? What about this apple, banana, pizza? And by showing an image that was more aligned with my audience's experiences and narrowing down the key messages, I could get enough attention to initiate a discussion and then eventually have them change their behaviors, not picking up the food to eat. Similarly, there are many cases where the science communication to the public increases the research impact and also helps people make better decisions. For example, last year, there were a lot of studies showing the science behind wearing masks or social distancing related to COVID-19, which were putting the simulation results with realistic 3D backgrounds instead of giving a bunch of figures and tables. That being said, your research could also have more impact by understanding potential groups who can use your findings to take actions. And the contextualized visual aids, especially in these virtual world can relieve an additional effort required to understand the science and deliver the key messages directly. And from here, Mary will introduce the key aspects in public communication of research.
Thank you for setting the stage so well for what I'm about to discuss. And for today's exercise, I'm definitely what we're considering a public audience because I don't have a background in science communication, and I'm going to use what I understand of Jiyoon's research to walk us through goal setting. So this also may give her a better sense of what a layperson takes away from her project overview. Goal setting. So before you can figure out who you're talking to and how to reach them, you have to have a goal or vision in mind. When you're sharing your research, what are you hoping to gain? Is it funding? Is it a policy change? Is it behavior change on the individual group level? Is it just general awareness of what you're working on? Success or your desired end results can help you set those goals, but the objectives within that goal are targeted steps that make it more bite-sized. So if we think of a goal as a general guideline that helps us explain what we want to achieve, e.g. for Jiyoon, it might be, I want to make food safer. That's accurate, but I think it's too broad for this. If we want, let's say she says, I want mid-level managers in the farming industry to modify their use of flume washers to maximize chlorine distribution uniformity, decreasing the risk of cross-contamination. It is accurate, but it is way too specific. So how about, I want to encourage adoption of technology that improves food safety monitoring. It's still accurate, but it's a lot easier for you to explain, and then it helps you set objectives that'll get you into the nitty-gritty. So I'm sure that all of you have heard of SMART objectives. You know, you're using objectives to define strategies or steps that you're gonna need to attain that first goal. And when we talk about SMART, sure, specific, measurable, attainable, they have a defined completion date. But for today's exercise, I want us to think about when we're setting these goals and objectives, who are we talking to? That will start by defining target audience and what motivates them or causes them to not want to do something. What do they need to know first? So does our target audience already understand what we're talking about, or do we have to educate them first? And what do we know? How do we best educate them? Is it a visual? Is it a diagram? Is it a presentation? Is it virtual reality? What's the timeline for the goal? How long is it going to take to educate them? And then what's going to come next? And then I think today, or at least for Jiyoon, the goal is really centered on education. And success is behavior change, or rather science-based decision-making. And we can measure that success by looking at the rate of adoption of this technology into food safety monitoring systems. Jiyoon, can you go to the next slide? So in that first bite-sized step of defining our objectives, who do you want to reach? Because the public is super large and you can't reach everyone, it's impossible. So reflecting on your own goals for communicating, you know, back to funding, policy, awareness, education, that can narrow down a few public audiences you might want to reach. So then you start researching. What do you know about this audience? Where can you find information about them? My recommendation is always to start with someone you know. Think about what motivates that person from adopting a new behavior. You can check out the library to see if there's any market research available. And I think you can usually just search market research. You can check sources like Pew Research Center to see if they've published anything helpful. You can look for government data sources. You can read trade magazines to get a sense of the language they use or what might appeal to people that are in that audience. You can read news articles profiling their industry to get an idea of current issues. You don't have to know everything about your target audience, just enough to generalize some characteristics. And next session, we're really going to delve into that and what can help us get a message to stick. But this was the point where we dive into a hands-on activity, because it's hard to do all this theoretically when I don't know what people's goals are in reaching public audiences, or what your research topics are more generally. And keep in mind, I'm a lay person, so all of your research is new and exciting and maybe a little complex for me.
For those of you who attended yesterday, we start brainstorming about the target audiences and goals for communicating your research projects. And today we will analyze those target audiences and narrow down the key messages that you may want to deliver. With that, at the end of the session 2, you will be able to understand your targeted public audiences, develop a general persona to describe your audiences, and use the personas to craft key messages. And I will hand it over to Mary.
Perfect. So thank you for that, Jiyoon. And if you weren't here or just don't remember yesterday, as she said, we talked about goal setting and how that ties into narrowing a target audience because you really just can't reach everyone with the same message. So what do you want to say and who needs to hear it? Today, we're going to talk about public audiences and how we can build a persona to help us talk about research in a way that resonates. But I want to start by summarizing some of the key points we talked about yesterday and then fill in some of the gaps because the session went pretty quickly and the concepts were deceptively complex. So number one, you're all doing research that is important and matters. We know it matters to you and your professors and likely others in your field. But I am almost 100% sure it also matters to different groups outside of the university. Number two, some of you might already have an idea of who these people outside of the university or these public audiences that might care about your research or benefit from it are. Some of you might not. That's totally fine. The tools we're talking about this week, goal setting, audience personas, 3D models, that's all still relevant once you have a better sense of who you want to reach and why you want to reach them. Number three, yesterday was a very quick and general overview of goal setting. Why do you want to reach a public audience? Is it funding, policy change, education, awareness, behavior change? If you don't know yet, that's fine. It takes time. If you already have multiple goals in mind and different audiences for each, that's great. We all have different personal and professional goals and different people we would talk to about each of them. Our office, Public Scholarship and Engagement, has different goals and different audiences within each of those goals. You might not know what your goals are yet or who your audiences may be for those goals. That's totally fine. I was trying to think about some research that I'm a little familiar with to give an example of unintended goals and audiences before we dive into personas today. So bear with me. In 2017, Professor Nancy Erbstein, who I believe is now at the School of Education, published a report on chronic absenteeism in the Sac City Unified School District. And she did this research in collaboration with the school district and the Center for Regional Change. Their goal was to understand and address some of the root causes of absenteeism. So before you know what her findings are, can anyone think of a public audience that might be interested in her work? We're thinking about school-age children that are chronically absent. We don't want them to be absent. Who wants to know about that? Oh, come on. This is like a softball. Okay, I won't make you dive in just yet, but get ready. So first of all, parents, school leaders, teachers, principals, any community agency that works with school-age children, district officials, so the superintendents or county offices of education, school board members, the California Department of Education, other research institutes or other schools of education. Some of those are people in her field, some of those have no connection to what she's researching. So her research that was done in collaboration with the school district included recommendations for those various public audiences. It got into the right hands. Wait, I forgot. One of the findings of her research was that chronic absenteeism could be traced to a lack of reliable transportation. So who might be interested in that? If we're thinking about it, okay, the school district might want to know, but they eliminated home to school busing in 2012. So what are they going to do with that information? Most students don't walk to school. So a parent hearing like a lack of reliable transportation, then maybe they're not driving the kid to school. So what's a way that someone might be able to get to school if they don't have a bus from their school anymore, they're not walking, they don't have a parent? Public transportation. So her research that was, again, done in collaboration with a school district and included recommendations for various public audiences got into the right hands. She did not necessarily identify the Sacramento City Council as one of her audiences, but a city council member read the report and he was also on the board of Sacramento Regional Transit. So what came out of these recommendations were free bus passes to every school-age child to make sure they were getting to school to try and reduce chronic absenteeism. So all of that to say, you can have multiple goals. And the specific goal of more reliable transportation may or may not have been on Nancy's radar when she released that report. But more likely, they just wanted to understand some of the challenges to getting kids to school and make recommendations to the school district. Regional transit probably wasn't one of the original audiences she had in mind, but because her research was presented in a way that local public policymakers understood it, they could put it into action. So that's what we're really trying to do. What are the broad reaches or implications or impacts your research can have, and how can we present it in a way that helps people understand and then take that into action? So we'll start with the next slide. Thanks, Rose. When we're thinking about audiences, what is a persona? It's just a fictional character that you, I won't say make up, but yeah, of course you make it up. They're composite people. They represent demographic groups that are important to your research, your organization, your school. They take insights about your audience and they translate them into a real person who you could use as a virtual sounding board in your decision making. They're never final. They evolve as your audience changes. New insights come out all the time about your relationship with those audiences. I think a good example is we know that the public is growing to distrust certain scientific organizations like CDC. And part of the reason is the public might not necessarily know what the scientific process is like. So when recommendations are changing in real time, it's undermining the trust we had in organizations like CDC, whereas people with a scientific background understand that this is part of the process. So those relationships between your target audience and your organization change over time. How do you start to develop a persona? That is the next slide. You have to ask the right questions. So if your question is, who are we talking to? What motivates their behavior change? The question you would ask to develop a persona is, who are they and how would you describe them? If your question is like, what do we need to know first? How do I determine the best method of educating them? Then you probably need to ask, where do they get their information and what sources of information do they trust? If your question is like, what do I say to them? How do I develop a message that resonates with them? For your persona, you're going to have to figure out what motivates them and what discourages them. And we will go over, you'll be provided with an audience persona template, and it will walk you through all of these and it'll have a sample in there. So don't worry if this is going kind of fast. It changes all the time. It never gets necessarily easier or harder, but you will get better at it. So what to include in a persona? Demographics are usually easier, that is the who they are. And the psychographics are the what are they like? Why is it important to segment your audience so you can deliver a more meaningful message to them? And I was going to try and come up with an example related to research to walk us through this, but I realized I am not as familiar with that. So I'm going to do a personal example. I sit on the board of a nonprofit called Alchemist CDC, and our mission is connecting communities to land, food, and opportunity. That just means we hold leases on a few residential properties that we've turned into green spaces. We process CalFresh or food stamps at the farmers market so people can use that money on fresh fruits and vegetables. And we have a food business training program. So food, land, opportunity. Let's say, who are my target audiences offhand? Can anyone think of what a nonprofit's target audiences might be? All right, clients, yes, Rose, donors. It's usually number one, even though it shouldn't be. Clients, the people we serve. donors, the people we want to give us money, and sometimes policymakers, the people that we want to ease barriers that might prevent us from doing work or make it easier for us to operate. So those are 3 different audiences. And within each of those audiences, I'm going to have a different goal. Again, donors, I want you to give us money. Clients, I want you to use our service. Policymakers, I want you to make it easier for us to operate. And within each of those audiences that each have a different goal, there are probably 3 to 5 personas I need to make to ensure that my messages can reach different segments. So I'm going to start with donors. There's an individual donor, right? You know, that's just maybe my friend that saw me post on Facebook and wants to support me. One might be a corporate donation, like Coca-Cola wanting to make sure that people in Atlanta have voting rights. So they might push their money towards that. And the other would be a foundation. So like California Endowment, they fund a lot of different programs that are supposed to benefit communities in California. Within each of these categories even, and this is why it can get so overwhelming if you think one message is going to reach everyone. Within each of those categories, corporate, foundation, individual, there are multiple personas. So the reason we create these and we essentialize and break someone down to a few characteristics that help them understand us is because it's super overwhelming. Large companies often have the resources to do this kind of thing through market research. They track and catalog the behavior of current and potential clients. And to a certain extent, UC Davis can do that. It's a big organization. But most of us don't have the time or resources. So we create an audience persona based on any data we can gather and some educated guesses. So the next slide is about doing the research. And it just gives you some ideas of how I start preparing these things. I think a lot of these suggestions are included in the template, so you don't have to note them now. And you'll probably also have access to this PowerPoint after. But my first piece of advice is always to start with someone you know, and then move on and see if you can figure out anything about other people through library resources, trade magazines, government data sources, or someone might have already done the work for you. So before we go into the hands-on activity, I'm going to share what the audience persona template that you guys will get looks like. Jiyoon's sharing it in the chat, and let me figure out how to share my screen. It is this one. Oops. So it's PDF, and it just reminds you again what a persona is: semi-fictional representation of your target audience. This is one that I pulled from UC Davis. That's a little bit old now, so I don't even necessarily know if they would love me using it, but you'll notice on the bottom, they say where some of their information sources are, and they're just news or articles. One's an old magazine, but they give most of those. These are your demographics on top, just some data points that are objective. And then the personality starts to get into psychographics. The day-to-day influence and challenges, these are all things that help figure out like what's gonna make this matter to this person. So I've included a worksheet that we'll walk through. And this one takes the information, the sample takes the information that is in this UC Davis sample persona and just breaks it out into different categories. So from that, I was able to pull out like, how does she spend her time? She skims the headlines, she meets with staffers, she hosts open hours. So what I learned from that is like, okay, staffers, if she's meeting with them daily, that might be a good way to get information to her. In the same way that Nancy didn't necessarily think to reach out to regional transit, but her information got into the hands of a city council member that is on the board. What do we know? Are we going to reach this representative directly, or are we going to get to her through staffers and aides? So we know that she's reading major news outlets, and we know that she's talking to other policymakers before she makes decisions. If we're looking at her social media as a sign of like, what is she interested in? That's probably not her. So we just have to consider where we think they're getting their information how we can best reach them, how we should present it, who we should target it to. And often I think about myself. I try to think about like, okay, when I watch TV, do I notice the commercials? Like, what makes me want to attend an event? Like, where am I most likely to see information about something? If someone is studying the impact of probiotics on a host, where would I find out about that information? Am I going to look on Facebook? Am I going to see it in a magazine on health? Am I going to look on the back of a bottle about probiotics? Am I going to learn it from a friend? So I'm going to go back to my personal example. You don't have to know everything about these people, just some general characteristics. And it's overwhelming to try and tailor your message to everyone. So just think of a few general characteristics that members of your audience share. And I often think in generational cohorts because millennials, they're not all the same, but they have far more in common than they would with someone in the greatest generation. So someone that's in their 80s now. So if I'm focusing on donors and my goal is to raise money, I can measure my success in both dollars raised and number of donors. And I want to make sure that the way I'm asking people resonates. If I'm trying to better understand a donor for a nonprofit, I can go about gathering this data by looking at past donors and trying to do some digging on them. What information do we already have about them? How often do they donate? What time of year? Is it towards the end of the year? So around December? Is it in the beginning of the year? If I Google them and looked at their LinkedIn, can I get an idea of where they work? Have they written any articles? Do they have social media? Okay, say I don't have that data. Can I figure out what other nonprofits in the area are doing for their donors? Do they have profiles? Are they featuring a donor of the month? With Give Day coming up, you'll notice that UC Davis does a lot of that. Okay, how do I tie that back to a persona? So I'm going to start with an individual donor and I'll say, okay, I'm going to use my uncle because as a board member, I have to start by asking my family to support my efforts. So what do I know about my uncle? He lives in the suburbs. He didn't go to college, but he had a steady, well-paying union job. He has a wife and 3 daughters, and he might lean conservative, but as he enters retirement, he enjoys house projects. He's been trying to eat healthier to extend his quality of life, and his kids might influence his political beliefs. So what do I know about him that could help me build a persona? I'm asking him for money, and I know he worked hard all of his life. So he probably thinks that other people should work hard for money too. He likes straight shooters. He wants people to cut to the chase and keep messaging direct because he's from a generation where they don't speak in the same way. That said, he has millennial kids, and those kids might be broadening his perspective on the world. So with that in mind, with me crafting a persona based on my own uncle, I want us to start. I will stop share, Jiyoon, and you can go back. I want us to try doing some of that for a potential audience for your research or your goal.
This week, we will start learning about the tools for 3D visuals and a web VR page. And Professor Chris Simmons from Department of the Food Science Technology will lead these sessions. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. As Jiyoon mentioned, I'm Chris Simmons. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology. A lot of what I do on the teaching side involves using visual communication to effectively educate people on highly technical concepts. And part of that is using virtual worlds. So I'm excited to talk a bit about that today.
So this is the 3rd session of the series of 5 webinars. And last week, we focused on why and what we're trying to talk and deliver, whereas sessions 3 and 4 will be more focused on how and technical skills. And for today, we will learn how to use the open source 3D drawing tool. And at the end of the session 3, you will be able to use Blender, which is an open source, robust and free 3D modeling and animation tool. And you'll be also able to explain basic concepts of 3D modeling and demonstrate the basic functionality of Blender. With that, Professor Simmons will share his screen for the Blender tutorial. And while we're switching the screen, please follow this link to, yeah, I'll share the link in the chat.
Great. So as Jiyoon mentioned, we'll be focusing on a particular piece of software today named Blender. It's a totally free 3D modeling and animation program, and it's really robust. Now, if you open Blender, you'll get this default scene like we have here. There's a lot going on here, but the good news is that you don't even need to know how most of it works to start making really cool visuals and virtual worlds with Blender. So my goal today is to tell you a bit about the basic functionality of Blender. How do we add objects to a scene? How do we render that out? How do we manipulate objects? And everything that I do in terms of how I'm interfacing with the software, you'll be able to see those commands in the lower left. For instance, if I click my mouse, you'll see down here that I click my mouse. If I press a key, you'll see exactly what keys I'm engaging. And I encourage you to go back and review the recording if you need to see these steps or go through it at your own pace, just because, again, the interface is complex. There's a lot of tiny icons, and sometimes it helps to just go back and revisit it at a slower pace. But to get into Blender, if you open the program, you'll get this default scene. And the default scene has three things in it. One is an object, a cube. One is a light, so that we can see the cube. And then we have a camera here. And what the camera functions as is our kind of eyes for if we want to take what we model and then output it as a 2D image, like a JPEG. Whatever that camera sees is what will end up in our image. But let's use this default cube to talk about some of the basic functionality of Blender. Oftentimes, if we have an object in a scene, we want to change it or manipulate it in some way. And we can do that through various commands. So we have this cube here, and I've just selected that with the left mouse key. Anything that has an orange outline around it is selected, and you can interact with it. So let's say we wanted to make the cube bigger or smaller. Once selected, we would press S, and if we drag our mouse, we can change the size of the cube. I'm just going to escape out to go back to its original size. Likewise, we can move it around. We could press G for grab, and then if we move our mouse, that object is going to move wherever we like. And if we click, we can place it into a new position. I'm going to escape out here so that we can go back to the origin. Likewise, we can select an object and press R to rotate it. As we move the mouse around, we can change the angle of rotation. So sometimes we want to be able to change an object not in all directions at once, but perhaps in just one of the three dimensions. And we can certainly do that. Let's say we select our cube and we just want to scale it in one direction. So if I press S to scale, it's going to do the multi-directional scaling. But let's say I want to just scale in the X axis. I can press the X key, and now I'll only scale along that axis. If I press Y, I'll scale along the Y axis. And if I press Z, I can scale along the Z axis. And this also works with the other commands. So if I grab it, I can confine how I move it to the X axis or the Y axis or the Z axis. Likewise with rotate. So if I press R to rotate, I could rotate it around the X, the Y, or the Z axis. And so again, you can confine your interactions to one of the three direct dimensions by just pressing X, Y, or Z on the keyboard while you have one of your scale, grab, or rotation commands active. So we can do more intricate modifications to an object as well. So if we click our cube, and if we look up here in the upper left, there's a little box that says object mode. Object mode is what you want to be in if you're trying to manipulate the entirety of an object at once. But if we click on that, there's another mode that we can select called edit mode. And if we go into edit mode, our cube looks a little different. We can see that the cube is composed now of these little dots connected by lines. And these dots are called vertices. Each one is called a vertex. And these vertices are connected by these lines that we call edges. So in edit mode, I can actually select individual vertices and I can use my commands on them. So let's say I grab this one vertex by left clicking it. I can then press G to grab that one vertex, and now I'm changing this cube into some other type of polygonal shape. And you can select multiple vertices at once. And so now I'm moving this whole edge here. And so I can grab it or I can rotate it. And so you can start to change these primary geometries into something more interesting and more complex. Another thing that you can do in edit mode is to select multiple vertices. And you can do that by just holding down Shift and clicking multiple vertices. You'll see here that when I selected these 4 vertices, this whole face of the cube became orange, saying that I have, in essence, selected this one face or this one side of the cube. One key thing that you can do in edit mode is you can extrude your vertices. So with these vertices selected, if I press E, I can actually extrude a new set of vertices from them. And if I click, it'll become final, and I can keep doing that. I can even select a different set of vertices and then press E to extrude in that direction. So by selecting faces in edit mode and extruding them, you can take an initial simple shape and start to create more complex shapes. So at this point, I'm going to go out of edit mode, back into object mode so that I can manipulate the whole object at once. We still have this active here. I want to tell you a little bit about how we can change how we view the object. So when you're using Blender, I really suggest using a 3-button mouse, not really a touchpad on a laptop. It doesn't work so well with that. But if you have a 3-button mouse with a left and right button and a scroll wheel, preferably a clickable scroll wheel, you can really easily change how you see your object through the viewport. For instance, if I use that scroll wheel and scroll, I can zoom my view in and out. If I click that scroll wheel and hold it and then move the mouse, I can orbit my view and I can see my object from any perspective I wish. And then if I hold down Shift and then click that mouse wheel, I can now pan my view, not orbiting anymore, but I'm in essence moving the viewport left, right, up, and down. So this is convenient if you need to kind of change how you're viewing the object as you manipulate it in edit mode, for instance, to access the different vertices that you may need to manipulate depending on what you're making. Now, when you launch Blender and you get this default cube, it's going to display as gray. If you're making gray objects, then that's just fine, but oftentimes you will want some other material to represent something else that's not gray. And so you can change the material properties of your object. If you look over here to the right, there's a little checkered red and black sphere. And if you click on that, that's where you can change the material properties of your object. Oftentimes you'll want to change the color. So if we go to base color and click on the current light gray, there's a color wheel that comes up and you can pick any color you like. I'll pick red. Now it still looks gray in the viewport, and that's because we've set the view settings in the viewport to not reflect our materials. So if we want to change that, we can go to the upper right. You'll see these various spheres displayed here. The default is this option here, which is the grayscale. If we go just to the right of that, then we go into material view. And so now that red material is reflected on our object in the viewport. If we were to change that color, we would see that change accordingly. Some other cool functions in Blender are these things called modifiers, and these are basically existing tools within Blender that you can apply to objects that you create, and it will do complex transformations that would otherwise be very difficult to do manually. One very common one is something called a subdivision surface modifier, and we can access all of our modifiers in this right menu by clicking on this little wrench. So if we click on that, the objects start with no modifiers on them. If I go to add modifier and then go to subdivision surface, what this modifier does is it basically takes the hard edges of your object and smooths them out. So if you're making some type of object that doesn't have very hard, sharp edges, for instance, many kind of organic materials are more rounded than they are sharp, then you can make a geometry that has sharp edges, apply this subdivision surface modifier, and it will basically smooth it out for you. Now, this still kind of looks a little bit blocky, a little bit polygonal. What you can do is right-click on it and say Shade Smooth, and that will kind of mask some of that and make it look a lot more rounded. You can also go over here and change the resolution of that subdivision surface modifier. As I ramp up the resolution, you can see it appears very, very smooth. So this is kind of an easy strategy to take something like a cube or a rectangular solid. You can extrude it and then apply a subdivision surface modifier to make a smooth stone or a cell or something like that, or a fruit, without having to manually go in there and create curves to make a rounded geometry. So what we've made here is derived from the initial cube that we start out with in Blender. You can add additional objects to your scene. And the way that you do that is by pressing Shift and A at the same time. And here is a menu where you can add what's called a new mesh. And what a mesh is just Blender lingo for a new shape. So if we go over to our list of meshes, there are a few options for what we can add. For instance, we can add a plane. So there's a plane here, and we can scale that, and you can grab it and move it. So oftentimes you'll add a plane if you want to create a surface like a floor or a tabletop. You don't want your object necessarily floating out in midair, so you can add a plane to act as a surface for your object to sit on. If we press Shift A, we can add additional meshes. For instance, let's add a cylinder. Perhaps we're making a tank, like a fermenter or a canned product or something like that. And so there's a lot you can do with just basic geometries, combining them together or going into edit mode and manipulating their scale, their rotation. You can extrude surfaces to get the shapes that you need. So I mentioned that this is what we see in the interface of the program. If we wanted to turn this into an image, we would have to see what our camera here sees. And so we can tell what our camera sees if we select it and then go to View, Viewpoint, Camera. So within this rectangle is what our camera sees. If we were to output what we've created as a 2D image, that image would contain what's within this bounding box here. So let's say the camera is not positioned how you like. Well, with your camera selected, you can use those same commands that we talked about earlier. We can press G to grab our camera, and as we move our mouse, the position of that camera will move, so we can frame our objects how we like. You could also press R for rotate and rotate your camera. And so you can really position it any way you like to capture your objects and make sure that the image that you output is what you want. When we talk about outputting an image, there's a word for that, and it's called render. So the process of rendering is taking our meshes or our shapes that we've created and translating that to an image or an animation, as the case may be. So there's a few ways to render. One is that you can go up to the left here, upper left, and click on render, render image, and then your computer will do all the hard work to transform what you have in your viewport to a JPEG that you can save. I'm just going to go over here and render in view here. And so when I do that, you can see that it's applying our light source and it's creating shadows according to the position of our objects in the light. And let's say you didn't like the lighting that you have, you can go into Shift A. Instead of going to Mesh, you can then go down to Light, and you can add in a new light. And you can press G to grab that light. You can move it around. You can even go and change the properties of that light. So if we click on the light bulb here, I can go and change the color of the light. I can change its intensity by changing the power. So as I ramp up that light, it becomes brighter and there's more of a red tone in the scene. So these are some of the very basic functionalities of Blender to add objects, to change how they appear, to change how they're lit, and to save them or render them out as an image. And we can use the same process, not just to make images, but to make 3D models that we can use to build virtual worlds. So I could take what I've built here, and if I go to File, Export, and I select this file format of GLTF, then I'll end up with a file that, as we'll see in the next session, I can import into another tool, and it will transform what I built here into a navigable environment that somebody can explore through their computer, through their mobile device, through a VR headset. So this is a very brief intro. I certainly encourage you to get into Blender, start to try some of these functions out for yourself, see if you can make something with primary shapes, change their color, export them as a GLTF. And if you can do that, we'll use your GLTF in the next session. I'll show you how to get that online in a way that will allow people to walk around like it's a virtual room, for instance.
So this is the fourth session of the series of 5 webinars, and today we'll be focusing on how to create a web VR page using the 3D model that we made yesterday. And at the end of the session 4, you'll be able to use A-Frame as a web development framework for creating virtual reality on the web, and explain basic concepts of using a template script with A-Frame and demonstrate the creation of a simple web VR site.
What A-Frame is just a way to use HTML coding to make web VR work. So ultimately, you need to have the actual code that you write and then some place to host it so that it's viewable online. What I use is this site Glitch, which is a free web hosting service that allows you to both code and see the output simultaneously. So you could use Glitch, or you could use UC Davis to host the site, or any hosting service that you like. But for the purpose of the tutorial, I'll use Glitch because it's open to everybody. Here I've logged in to Glitch, and what I've done is create a small piece of template code that anybody can access and modify themselves. And so I thought I would just go through what that code is doing. So when you're in Glitch, you want to go to your index HTML file, and that brings up the template code. So any HTML file is going to have a head region and a body region. And in the head region, you define some things about your web page, like the title and some of the existing scripts that you want to use. So for instance, I'm calling one script here, which is actually the script for A-Frame. So by calling that script, it brings up access to all the tools in the A-Frame development network that will make the web VR work. And then I've called another script that loads some additional tools for A-Frame, like the ability to use your keyboard and make the user avatar move around in the environment. So that does it for the head of the code. The body is really where you spend most of your time, because that's where you define and arrange all the elements of your virtual environment. So within the body, there's this scene tag that captures everything that we want to be in our virtual environment scene. So this is where you can define things like the background color, how your mouse behaves. And so these are all things that if you download the template, you can just keep them as is. You don't have to fool with that. Also put some lights in here so that you can see your model, just some kind of neutral lighting, or else everything would just appear flat black. Again, people don't have to tinker with that, but they could if they want to. And so here's where we get to the parts where some things do need to be changed. For instance, there's this element of the code where we define our assets. And for instance, that Blender model is an asset that we need to load into A-Frame. So this tells us to call that GLTF model. And then we need to put some code to display that model. And that's the code here. So again, these are all things that people can tinker with if they want to. If not, they should still get something workable just by dropping in their Blender model. And then there's some code here that controls how the player can move through the environment. And people can keep that as is. They shouldn't need to modify that. So now let's go through getting that Blender model into A-Frame. So to do that, you need to go on the left here up to Assets and upload an asset. And so here's the one that I just made. We'll go ahead and upload that. It pops up. You click on that, and then you can get this URL for where that model is now hosted online. You can just click copy to get that URL. And you need to now paste that into your HTML file as the source for your 3D model. So if we go back to the HTML index file, there's a little place here, a string of X's, and I have a comment here that says you should replace those X's with the URL for your asset. So if we paste that in, we now have defined the source as that URL. Sometimes, I don't know why it does this, the URL will have some junk at the end here. You need to actually delete that so that the file extension is the last part of the URL. So now something should display if we go to show the site. So yeah, indeed the model is here, and I can, now walk around and view it. So at a basic level, this is the minimum amount that needs to be done to get something online as a virtual environment. The beautiful thing about A-Frame is that it's already done all the work for you to make this VR ready. So this button in the corner now, if you were to click that while wearing the headset, it would now come up as a fully 3D environment. So for instance, here's a virtual environment that I used in one of my classes, and this is a model that was built in Blender, and each shape that you see here started as some primary shape like we talked about in Blender, and then manipulated to make it more intricate. So you'll see up here in the address bar, that's the URL that glitch.me generated. So anybody, you included, could type this URL into your browser, and this virtual environment would appear for you. And the code that I've provided provides some ability for the user to navigate the environment. So you can use your arrow keys, and you can click on the screen and drag it to look around. So if I click on the screen and drag it, I can rotate my view. I can use my arrow keys to walk around. And so I use this in class as a kind of virtual tour to show people all the equipment that's involved in milk processing. Another great thing about A-Frame and your glitch site, if you look down here in the bottom right, there's this VR button. So if you were to access this website through a browser on your VR headset, and then you click this button, it will automatically go into VR mode. And so then your user will see all this equipment, life size. They'll be able to walk around it with the sensation that they're walking around a real place. It'll be fully 3D. And so it's kind of magical that, all you need to do is make that model in Blender, upload it, and then all this, wonderful capability is at your fingertips to put it online as a virtual environment, to make it navigable and in 3D. And as you become more comfortable with the coding, you can do other things. Like, for instance, I've actually uploaded 2 models here, and I put a button in the environment that allows us to toggle between which environment is displayed to the user. So when I click this button in the virtual environment, it annotates and color codes all the different pipes so that people can more easily track what's going where during milk processing. So I think this is handy in any situation for communicating technical concepts. Been particularly useful during the pandemic as a remote learning tool where we can't get people on site to view our own equipment. We can at least give them a virtual environment to get a more authentic sense of the scale and orientation of these 3D facilities. And that's especially true if you can access it through a VR headset. You really get an experience that is as close as you can get to genuinely being there without actually being there. But if you have any questions at this point, would be happy to answer anything regarding Blender, the workflow to get out of Blender to A-Frame, the A-Frame code, uploading your elements to Glitch. Anything you might want to talk about, I'm happy to.
For today, I will share a case study where we used the learned skills from the previous sessions to make a 3D VR-based visuals for research communication with a public audience. At the end of the session 5, you'll be able to review skills learned during this webinar series and integrate the learned skills through a case study. So here's a brief review of the skills learned from each session. In session 1, we talked about goal setting and identified target public audiences. And based on that, we analyze our target audiences by looking into their personas and determine key messages we want to deliver to those audiences. And in session 3, we use Blender to create a simple 3D model followed by the web development using A-Frame with a GlitchMe server to make it available through virtual worlds. And with that, I will share how I integrated these skills into my own research project. This is a case study initiated by my research findings and a project for educational purposes that Professor Simmons and I are involved in. It was originally designed for undergraduates in food science and ag bioengineering to improve their learning and understandings of chemical sanitizer distribution in a flume washer. And this is typically used for fruits and vegetables. And I think Mary briefly mentioned this project during session 1, and she helped me a lot to transfer the audience from undergraduates to the public outside UC Davis for this project. And we did similar activities that were covered in the first 2 sessions. As shown here, we started by applying the skills learned from session 1, identifying target audiences and goal setting. In this case, the target audience was food safety / quality assurance managers of the fresh produce industry. And to give you some context, the fresh produce industry has not been evolved by food scientists. So there are technologists and automatic devices there, but not necessarily doing the right thing when it comes to microbiology and biochemical treatments. So one of the first things that food scientists or engineers should do is to convince the industry workers, especially someone who might have the power to change the practices. But often it's not easy because they don't want to spend more money to change something unless a serious problem happens. So there is the unmet needs to make them believe the science by showing them some visuals, maybe in that, and especially in their perspectives, so that we can reduce the gaps between science and practices. Having said that, the objectives of my case were to translate research to the industry and apply science in their decision making and adopting a new technology into the process control system. For the following step, the audience persona analysis was done for our target as we did in session 2. I know that the texts here are tiny, so I'm not going to ask you to read all things, but I will summarize what I wrote down here. So this was created following the audience persona analysis template. And the top lines are just showing the repeat of goals and audiences in each session. Yeah, I'm trying to admit more people here. And as you can see, there is a cross line, which means that I actually changed my audience in the process to narrow it down. So initially I just wrote like industry person. And then after talking with Mary, I realized that that was too broad. So yeah, that's why I updated the audience by narrowing down, thinking about a specific person that would do the action after talking with us. And yeah, here this section is showing demographics, background, personality, and so on. And I was actually lucky enough to know someone in the fresh produce industry whom I met during in-person research meeting in their facility. And I had a chance to talk more about himself during the lunchtime. And at the time, I wasn't really planning to come up with this project, but I realized that I actually asked him some of the questions that are needed to complete this template. And if there is any missing information, it was easy to just guess someone similar to that person, like in the same age or similar personality, especially because he was like a person who was having a scientific curiosity a lot. So it was kind of similar to grad students or professors around me. For example, in this case, like the background, I knew that he grew up in an agricultural family, but I really didn't know how many kids he had. So in this case, I had some imagination and thinking about his personality and how he cares about his family. And with that, I was thinking, yeah, probably he's going to have more interest in family and their health. So I was trying to make some messages align with those issues. And based on this persona analysis, I created the key messages to deliver. And I try to make it like simple enough, like just 3 messages here, because if it's a lot, then maybe they're not going to really remember what I was trying to say. And these were highlighting the importance of washing process of fresh produce and current problems in this process, which is related to sanitizer distribution, and also the issues with current device, which may not be ideal for sanitizer mixing for fresh produce. And based on this key message, we put some background information which defines the problem in current processing environment. And again, these were kept to be simple enough by focusing on the 3 key messages that we took from the previous slides and just giving some background information that is necessary to understand what I'm going to show later on. To describe what's happening in the washing device for research purposes, I use a modeling and numerical simulation approach. And this slide shows the complexity and theories that might be required to understand and interpret the research data. And typically when we talk this to more academic audiences, for example, in conferences, we share this information and even more detailed equations and numbers to enable them read the final results. However, in this case, the public target audience may not have an interest in understanding those theoretical aspects. So we were trying to focus on generating visuals rather than going into all the theories shown here. And the visuals that could add a context to the simulation results in terms of what the audience might be familiar with. So we took the physical appearance of washing device that was used in our simulation as well as experimental measurements. And this is also something that mimics what our target audiences, to say fresh produce safety managers, use in their everyday work. So it should give some familiarity to them. So basically our solution was putting a spatial data set into a relevant virtual environment using VR. This 3D environment was created by Professor Simmons using Blender based on the photo of the actual device that I just shared in the previous slide. And the skills used in this process was quite similar to what we have learned during session 3, creating objects and planes, setting the lights in different location, and so on. And also changing some colors and metros. And we use the heat maps at data sets acquired from my simulation study. And these results were added to the 3D environment in Blender, finding their respective locations. Then the 3D model, including the data sets, was exported as GLTF, as we learned in session 3. And that GLTF file was loaded to A-Frame using GlitchMe account to create this web VR page, which was described in session 4. And as you can see here, if you have followed the link that I sent last night, there is already written code if you just click that link. And this is almost similar to that, but adding some details about different things. So here's a QR code to our virtual lab that I've also shared in session 1. And you can also just scan this QR code with your cell phone camera, which will take you to the lab. And it will give you the best VR type experience when you use the headsets, but you may still be able to explore the lab even without the headsets by touching your screen and moving around your phone. And this framework could be especially beneficial for the cases where you can add context for the target audiences by showing the environment related to your data. But when it's not easy or physically not available to do that due to the traveling constraints, safety issues, or any other access restrictions. And for an additional information, here are some examples showing that you can further utilize this VR framework by checking their technical understanding and their learning motivation. And this kind of evaluation will help you check if this was really helping them or not, so that you can improve your approaches for future trials. And if you're actually planning to explore your project with this kind of VR framework, we're actually happy to discuss with you further, either in this session or later on. And we're actually open to any topics and love to see how this framework could be stretched out. With that, we would like to thank you for joining the live sessions or watching the recordings of this webinar series. And here are the links to the survey for each session, so please provide your feedback at any point. And if you have more general comments for this webinar series, you may use the link for session 5, which is at the bottom of the slide. And we'll be open to future collaborations, so please reach out to us by the email addresses here if you have any questions or thoughts. Thank you.